The story begins in a forested area near the town of Tanner, where a sawmill is in full operation. At the end of the workday, the foreman calls over the radio to the only group that hasn't gone home yet, but no one responds until a voice, covered by heavy static, seems to be asking for help. The foreman decides to check if everything is okay and finds the radio lying on the ground, with someone's arm right next to it. Feeling a drip on his shoulder, he looks up and discovers where the rest is. Terrified, he quickly returns to the car, but something comes trotting at a much greater speed and breaks the back window, attacking the poor foreman next. South of Tanner is the small town of Maiden Woods, where Paul Shields is the sheriff. At this moment, he and Deputy Sheriff Donnie Saunders are responding to a call from Farmer Ron Jenkins. He says someone has stolen one of his horses, but Paul finds no clue as to how this happened and suspects the animal may have simply run away. Ron counters that he's never seen a horse jump a fence that high without breaking something. He states that all his animals have identification, and the horse that went missing was number 88. With nothing much to do, Paul and Donnie regret the incident and close the case despite the farmers' protests. Young Claire shows up when the two are already leaving. Paul tells Donnie to be careful with admiration because the last guy who tried to date Ron's daughter ended up getting shot. After this, Paul goes to pick up his son Adam to spend the weekend with him. His wife, Susan, recently returned to her mother's house, and the atmosphere between the ex-couple is still filled with resentment. Arriving home, the boy is astonished by his father's lack of ability in the kitchen and asks when Susan will return. As Paul explains the complicated situation, a sinister shadow rushes past the back door, and Adam says there is someone in the yard. Paul thinks it's just the boy's imagination but prefers not to contradict him at this delicate moment and decides to take a look. He finds it strange when Adam says it's better to take the gun, but he assures him that it's not necessary. Going out with just a flashlight, he hears the sound of twigs and leaves, as if something is moving. He starts calling out, announcing that this is the sheriff's house, but when no one responds, he goes back inside. A little later, he puts Adam to bed and tries to hold back tears upon seeing the empty bed that belonged to his other son, Tim. The next day, Donnie arrives while Paul is making coffee and asks if he has left the house today. Strangely, Paul accompanies him to the door, and Donnie shows him a bizarre trail on the floor. The prints are of a horse's hoof, but by the spacing between them, it can be seen that they were left by a biped. Paul is alarmed to realize that whatever did this seems to have stopped in front of the window at some point, as if spying on the family. But then Donnie says that his house has similar tracks, and it is just now that Paul understands the real strangeness of the case. The entire town has awoken to find it covered in tracks, and the residents are very frightened. Paul and Donnie follow the trail until they enter the wooded area, where the tracks abruptly disappear without explanation. Paul also finds claw marks on a tree trunk. Later, at the sheriff's office, Donnie is turning to attend to the many anxious residents. Paul's task is not much better, as he has to inform the case to the Forest Service. Assuring him that there is no bipedal animal with hooves, the staff practically laugh in the sheriff's face. The truth is that Paul agrees this is all a bad prank and is only investigating because the neighborhood won't settle without a culprit. Donnie isn't so sure of that version anymore, as he finds it very difficult that someone could have spread those marks without leaving their own footprints, but Paul doesn't pay attention to him. Soon after, the priest arrives, saying that his dog has disappeared and that he is not the only animal that fled during the night. At the grocery store, Paul feels everyone's gaze upon him, demanding an explanation. Claire is working at the register, and she says that her father has some crazy ideas. Hearing the conversation, a resident named Jim mentions the old stories his grandfather told about a creature that lives in the Maiden Woods forest. Irritated, Paul says that it's this kind of legend that motivates jokers to pull pranks like that. Jim responds that it must have been Donnie who did it because he came from New York and must be bored there. Leaving the store, Paul encounters his friend Earl, who also has something strange to report. He says that almost all the animals in the forest seem to have gone away, and this usually happens when they detect some kind of threat. After that, Paul goes back to his mother-in-law's house to pick up Adam. Susan says that he is scared because the other kids are saying the tracks are from the devil. Once again, she tries to get Paul to open up to her, but he barely responds and doesn't want to talk. It is already night when he is getting home with Adam, and the boy screams, saying he saw something in the yard again. Paul is starting to get annoyed with this, but then he also sees something. The creature passes through the light very quickly, and Paul can't say what it is, but the sound of galloping hooves is unmistakable. He tells Adam to stay in the car and heads out with the flashlight. The thing is stopped in the middle of the trees and bolts away when the beam of light hits it. Paul begins to chase it through the woods but soon loses sight of it. Hearing a metallic sound from the top of a tree, he discovers an object stuck on a branch. It's a horse bridle marked with the number 88. Very intrigued, Paul returns to the car and panics when he sees that Adam is not there. He begins to search inside the house, and the boy finally appears, explaining that he heard something outside and got scared. Meanwhile, Earl is serving Donnie at his bar. He tells the officer that his grandmother was Native American and she told him various things about that forest. According to legend, spirits have held a grudge against the white man since the Europeans invaded that area. Donnie asks if he really believes that, and he recounts an old case about a boy who disappeared. The body was found in the woods more than 10 meters high, and no one could provide a reasonable explanation. Days later, Paul and Susan are called to school, and the teacher complains that Adam taught a bad word to his classmates. She writes the word on a pad, and the two start laughing when they discover it's nothing serious. The teacher gets annoyed and says there is another problem. Adam always talks about Tim in the present tense as if he is still alive. Furious at the teacher's attitude, Susan begins to yell and says her son can talk about his brother however he wants. Leaving the school, she breaks down in tears and hugs Paul. The next day, he finds Donnie in front of the church, and both are startled by a flock of birds flying south when normally they would be heading north. Donnie even mentions the legends that Earl told him, but Paul doesn't entertain mysticism and says that it's always someone's fault. Since Donnie came to the town not long ago, he only learns of the recent tragedy in the sheriff's family when he helps Susan with the car and she shares what happened. Paul was home alone with Tim when the boy had an accident in the pool. Apparently, the boy slipped and hit his head on the bottom. She explains that she never blamed her husband, but he blames himself so much that it has started to corrode the family, and this is why she decided to separate. That night, Paul and Donnie are once again called to Ron's farm, and Claire is trying to disarm her father when they arrive. Ron says that his horses have been very nervous for days, and he didn't know why until yesterday. Around 3 in the morning, someone attacked the barn, pounding against the walls hard and leaving the animals almost frantic. Ron declares that he will not allow this to happen again and is ready to defend his farm, but Claire preferred to call the police, fearing her father would take risks. Paul talks to Ron and tries to calm him down, but a light bulb bursts while he is speaking, and everyone is already hearing the frantic whinnies. Donnie is tasked with keeping the farmer away from the barn while Paul investigates. Soon, they begin hearing banging on the walls as if something is trying to get in, and Paul again sees the creature in a glimpse. Donnie gets startled by his scream and comes to help, but the thing has already disappeared into the darkness. The two return early in the morning to look for clues and find the outside of the barn all scratched by claws. Ron shows the marks on the ground and states that this wasn't made by a horse, as the front is divided into 3 parts, and horses' hooves don't do that. A search on the internet reveals that no known animal has that kind of hoof, and some results mention a demon called Wendigo. To make matters worse, a severe storm is coming, and authorities recommend a partial evacuation of the area. Paul also finds a deer by the roadside, and the state of the animal suggests a very fierce predator. On top of all this, the sheriff still has to face his own family drama. During lunch with his parents, Adam begins to ask when the two will reconcile and why his mom cries so much. Soon, Paul ends the subject. At night, Donnie goes to have coffee at the store where Claire works, and the two flirt until Paul calls him on the radio. He has just come across yet another dead deer, this time right in the middle of the road. He approaches to examine the claw marks and starts hearing stealthy movement around him. Suddenly, the creature runs right in front of the headlights, and Paul even falls back from the fright. As soon as he gets into the car, the deer's carcass inexplicably disappears from the road. This finally shakes the sheriff's confidence in simpler explanations. He goes to Earl's bar to talk to Donnie and says that the legends about the forest may have been interpretations of something that really exists. Jim also shows up at the bar and begins to provoke the two officers, doubting their competence. The next morning, 3 hunters venture into the Maiden Woods forest and soon realize that something is wrong. When the creature runs past, one of them asks if it was a bear, but the others say it was too fast. Then one of them is suddenly attacked and only has time to fire a single shot. At the sheriff's office, Donnie speaks about the incident in New York that ended up causing his transfer. He was shot during a shooting, and his partner did not survive. Now he thinks that this might have been God's work and that his place is truly in Maiden Woods. Paul doesn't like much of the religious talk, as he has clearly lost faith since Tim's death. However, when he goes into the woods to search for more clues about the possible monster, he hears his deceased son laughing and even calls out his name. Suddenly, a hand grabs his shoulder, and we see that it is one of the 3 hunters begging for help. At the sheriff's office, he introduces himself as Robert and states that he was hunting with friends Manny and Ryan when the two were attacked by a very strong and fast creature. Robert is obviously traumatized and says he doesn't know exactly what he saw. But when Paul promises to find his friends, he shows no hope that they are still alive. Soon after, Paul gets a call from Earl and goes to meet him in the forest alongside Donnie. Jim is also there with a look of outrage and fear. He and Earl found something horrible while hunting. Parts of Robert's friends are stuck in the tops of the trees. Jim gets angry when Paul says that the hunting season is ending early, as he wanted very much a chance to catch the monster, but the sheriff makes it clear that no one else should enter the forest for now. Upon learning about the attacks, the Forest Service promises to send an armed unit within 24 hours. Paul states that, at least, many people have left town due to the storm, and Donnie is confident that the two can keep the remaining residents safe until then. The partial evacuation of the area continues throughout the day. At night, Susan thanks Paul for staying with Adam, as the boy is scared of the storm and feels safer with his father. After Adam goes to sleep, Paul calls Donnie to discuss some theories. He opens a map of the region and shows that there is a denser and more remote forest north of Maiden Woods. The nearest town there is Tanner, and their sheriff sent some documents about what happened at the sawmill. Paul suspects that the mysterious animal was hiding in that other forest until the trees started coming down. He had to migrate south, and the Maiden Woods forest is the last on the way. Now the creature is cornered, and its only way out is to fight for territory. The two continue chatting when Jim knocks on the door. He says he set up a camera in the forest and wants to show them the video. After a few minutes of snow falling, something brushes against the camera and knocks it to the ground. In an enlarged image from the recording, Jim shows a silhouette of something that appears to be a person. He leaves the photos with Paul before leaving, and Donnie goes home too. A little later, we see the creature approaching the town. Unable to sleep, Paul continues studying the case until he hears a massive crash that wakes Adam immediately. Realizing that his house is being attacked, he runs upstairs and locks himself in the bathroom with his son. He tells the boy to hide and tries to talk to Donnie over the radio while listening to his living room being destroyed. Paul has to keep his voice low, so Donnie can't hear him well, but eventually, he gets the message and immediately turns on the sirens, turning around. At the same time, we see that the pair of hooves is beginning to climb the stairs. The monster stops right in front of the bathroom, and Paul signals for his son to contain his fear as the shadows of the paws appear under the door. However, Donnie is also arriving, and the animal seems startled by the sirens. Paul hears the sound of breaking glass and a quick step passing over the roof. He cautiously exits the bathroom and tells Adam to lock the door behind him. Donnie runs into the creature as soon as he exits his car and gets toppled, but quickly composes himself and starts shooting. The two decide to gather all the residents who remained in town inside the church. Paul explains the situation to them and tells the whole truth. He admits that the threat is very serious but assures them that the Forest Service is on the way. They just need to hold on for one more night, and everything will be okay. Claire asks how they know the monster won't enter there too. Paul replies that the church is the only option as it is the sturdiest and easiest building to defend. In this way, everyone huddles together as best as they can and hopes the morning will come soon. Susan shows Paul the drawings of Adam so he can see how much the boy trusts that his father will defeat the monster. Seeing Tim in the last drawing, Paul finally weeps and confesses that he does not feel capable of protecting anyone since he couldn't even save his son. Susan repeats that none of this was his fault and says she regrets leaving the house. She reminds him that those people are there because they trust the sheriff and all need him very much at that moment. The banging begins right after she says this, first on the sides of the church and then coming from above. Seeing the look of fear on everyone he knows, Paul almost freezes. But soon he regains control of the situation and tells everyone to stay away from the windows. The monster is attacking the front door, which shakes violently and does not seem like it will hold much longer. Paul and Donnie draw their weapons and prepare for the confrontation, but they know that they may not be able to stop it alone. Then Paul remembers that there is a shelter underneath the church and tells everyone to go down there. After they seal themselves in the basement, Paul kisses his wife and hugs his son, saying he will go back up again because the doors won't withstand the pressure. He wants Donnie to stay there to help the others, but Jim volunteers to do it with Earl, as no one wants Paul to face the beast alone. He eventually agrees and heads up the stairs with Donnie right behind him. As they reach the ground floor, the banging stops, but the lights go out. The two proceed with their flashlights, and Paul sees that the door is wide open. A noise of things breaking comes from the room next to the altar, but there's nothing there when they enter. Since the room has a second door that leads to a corridor, Paul leaves Donnie there as a lookout, ordering him not to let the creature through. As Paul crosses the corridor and begins to search the rooms on the other side, a shadow passes behind Donnie and goes into the kitchen. The sound of falling pots catches his attention, and he follows the noise until he sees a footprint on the floor. He bends down to examine it and sees that it is broken into 3 parts like the others. When Donnie stands up, he is grabbed by the shoulder from behind and drops his flashlight while shouting. Both the sheriff and the people in the basement hear him squeeze the trigger. Paul begins to back away, and Donnie frees himself from the monster's grip, seeing that he managed to injure it. Seeing the reflection of the creature in a kettle, he fires several times, but misses the target. When Paul returns, Donnie says he is okay and tells him to go after the monster before it recovers. Then the sheriff continues searching until he feels a presence right behind him. He quickly turns around and starts firing, but the beast retaliates and disarms him. Realizing that he has not defeated the monster, Paul hides under the church benches, holding his breath as the monster hunts for him. He carefully cocks the other weapon to avoid making noise, and as soon as he is discovered, he fires 2 more shots. The monster leaves, but it leaves a trail of blood behind. Paul begins to follow it until a lamp crashes on the opposite side, and he doesn't see that his enemy is crossing the ceiling. At that moment, the monster jumps right in the middle of the church and reveals itself entirely for the first time. Paul keeps shooting until he is knocked down and does not cower even when that horrendous thing bares its teeth at him. Shoving the knife into its scaly trunk, the sheriff finally slays his enemy. He warns the others that the nightmare is over, and they all return to the church, relieved. But then Donnie looks at the creature lying on the floor and discovers something terrible. He is sure he shot the monster's shoulder, but he doesn't see a wound. As Paul begins to understand that this is no single monster, we see that there are several others outside, ready to attack the church.